She stepped onto the creaking porch, bowl in hand, heart pounding. The wind carried a faint rustle, then a low growl from the shadows. She froze. The bear was already there. Watching. Waiting. And somehow, it knew her name. Margaret had always loved the solitude of her cabin in the northern wilderness. It wasn't isolation for isolation's sake, it was a deliberate choice, a place where the noise of the modern world could not intrude. She had spent countless winters alone here, tending to her small garden, chopping firewood, and tracing the tracks of animals across the frozen lake. But this night was different. The first whisper of unease came in the form of a soft scratching at the cabin's wooden door. Margaret, perched in her favorite armchair near the fire, had been reading a tattered novel about old forest folk tales, the warm amber light casting flickering shadows across the room. The scratching came again, deliberate, persistent. She froze, her eyes straining in the dim light. Probably just a raccoon, she muttered to herself. Her voice, though confident, didn't convince her. There was something heavier in the sound this time, something deliberate. She glanced at the window. Beyond the thin pane of glass, the night seemed impossibly dark, a velvet curtain pierced only by the cold glint of starlight on the snow-covered pine trees. The bowl of food she had left outside, fresh berries, small bits of bread, even a slice of leftover salmon, was meant for the occasional deer or fox she sometimes saw passing. Margaret wasn't naive, she knew bears roamed the region. But seeing one was always a rare, almost mystical encounter. Tonight, however, she suspected she wasn't going to be seeing one from afar. The scratching intensified, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that resonated through the wooden frame of the cabin. Margaret's heart began to race. She debated her options, opened the door slightly to shoo away whatever animal it might be, or retreat further into the cabin. Curiosity and caution wrestled for dominance in her mind. She knew bears were dangerous, yet something in the rhythm of the scratches felt hesitant, almost careful. Slowly, she moved to the door. Her boots creaked on the wooden floorboards, the sound loud in the cold night air. She paused, hand hovering over the latch, and exhaled slowly. Whoever, or whatever, was out there, it was waiting. Margaret's instincts screamed both fear and fascination. Then she saw him. The bear, massive and covered in thick brown fur dusted with snow, stood just beyond the porch, eyes locked on her. He was not aggressive, not yet. His posture was cautious, almost polite, as if he understood boundaries in a way few humans did. Margaret's fingers trembled as she placed the bowl down slowly on the wooden planks. "Here," she whispered, barely audible over the rustling of the trees. The bear sniffed the air, eyes never leaving her. Then, with surprising gentleness, he approached the bowl, nudging it with a wet snout. Margaret's pulse surged, not from fear now, but from awe. The proximity of this wild creature, the raw power contained in its massive frame, should have terrified her. And yet, there was something fragile in its behavior, a cautious grace that made her chest tighten with emotion. Minutes stretched into eternity. The bear ate, careful not to make a sound beyond the soft crunch of berries. Margaret watched every movement, memorizing each flick of his ears, each tilt of his head. There was intelligence there, a silent acknowledgement of her presence. She felt an inexplicable connection, one that transcended words. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, the bear lifted his head. His dark eyes scanned the forest beyond the cabin, alert, aware of dangers she could not see. He lingered for a moment longer, almost as if thanking her, before retreating silently into the shadows. Margaret exhaled, the tension in her body dissolving into a strange cocktail of relief, wonder, and lingering fear. She returned inside, bolting the door behind her. The fire crackled, the room seemed warmer now, though her mind refused to calm. What had just happened? She had fed a bear, a wild, unpredictable animal. It was reckless, perhaps even foolish. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was the beginning of something profound. Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed, listening to the wind, imagining the bear wandering the snowy forest. Something deep inside her stirred, a mix of maternal protectiveness and unexplainable kinship with the creature she had just fed. And as she finally drifted into a fitful sleep, she knew, somehow, that he would return. The first light of dawn brought with it a quiet stillness. Snow crunched softly under her boots as she stepped outside, half expecting the bear to be waiting. The bowl was empty. Every last berry gone. Margaret's breath formed clouds in the cold morning air. Her mind raced with questions. Why did he come back? Would he come again tonight? Could she survive another encounter? And as she gazed toward the shadowed tree line, a sudden rustle made her turn sharply. Something, or someone, was moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. Margaret's pulse quickened. Her instincts screamed at her to retreat, but a part of her leaned forward, drawn by curiosity and the inexplicable bond forming already. A low growl echoed from the tree-line, closer than before, and Margaret realized he was not alone. Something else was moving in the shadows, and this time, she might not be the one in control. The second night arrived faster than Margaret expected. During the day, she moved through her routine with a heightened awareness. Every snap of a branch in the snow, every distant bird call felt amplified, as if the forest itself had taken on a new significance. Her encounter with the bear had left an imprint she couldn't ignore. She was both thrilled and terrified at the thought of seeing him again. Margaret carefully prepared another small bowl of food, mindful to make it just enough to attract him but not to encourage dependence. Fresh berries, a slice of smoked salmon, and a few crumbs of bread she had saved from breakfast. She placed it on the porch just as twilight began to settle over the treetops, the snow reflecting a pale blue light. The cabin felt smaller than usual, the silence pressing in around her. Hours passed. The wind rustled through the pine branches, carrying faint scents of earth and snow. Margaret sat near the window, a mug of tea warming her hands, listening intently. Then, the sound arrived, a crunching of snow, deliberate and slow. Her heart leapt. She could see the outline before the shadows fully revealed him, the massive brown bear, moving with a surprising fluidity through the snow, sniffing the air as he approached her porch. But this time, something was different. He hesitated at the edge of the clearing, eyes scanning the forest behind him. Margaret noticed subtle movements in the trees, a flicker of fur, a shift in shadow. There was another presence, something smaller, moving quickly. She swallowed, a lump forming in her throat. The bear seemed aware of it too, his ears flicking toward the sound, nostrils flaring. He returned to the bowl, sniffed the food, then looked back toward the forest. Margaret realized with a shiver that this might be a younger bear, perhaps a cub, following him. Her mind raced. She had read about bears leading their young to find food and safety. Could he be teaching his cub? Was this why his approach last night had felt so careful, almost methodical? Margaret took a slow breath and remained still, not wanting to disturb him. The bear began to eat again, slower this time, glancing toward the tree-line every few seconds. The wind shifted, carrying a faint but distinct scent of pine sap and animal musk. Margaret's pulse raced with a mixture of fear and awe. Here was a wild creature, untamed, enormous, yet capable of subtle consideration and intelligence that she had never fully appreciated until this moment. She watched as the cub emerged from behind a cluster of snow-laden pines. It was smaller, shaggy, and awkward, clearly learning from the older bear. The adult bear, presumably the mother or father, remained vigilant, occasionally nudging the cub forward toward the food. Margaret's breath caught. This was no ordinary encounter. She was witnessing the quiet, intimate rhythm of a family in the wild, a lesson in survival that she had never expected to see from her cabin porch. The bears ate together, but the tension was palpable. Margaret could sense the potential danger if she made any sudden movements. She sipped her tea slowly, careful not to spill it. Her eyes never left them, absorbing every gesture, every flick of an ear, every cautious sniff. It was astonishing how something so massive could move with such care and precision, teaching, protecting, yet still respecting boundaries in a way that humans rarely achieved. Hours seemed to pass, though Margaret had no sense of time. The forest held its breath, the silence punctuated only by the crunch of snow beneath heavy paws. Finally, the bears retreated together, moving as one through the shadows, disappearing into the darkness with a grace that belied their size. Margaret's hands were frozen around her mug, and her heart felt both heavy and exhilarated. That night, she couldn't sleep again. Images of the bears lingered in her mind, the cub's tentative steps, the protective gaze of the adult. She wondered if they would return the next night. More importantly, she wondered what would happen if the bears began to associate her cabin with food regularly. Could she maintain this fragile balance without inviting danger? As she lay in bed, she replayed the scene in her mind. She realized that she had crossed an invisible threshold, the bears now recognized her presence, and she, in turn, had become emotionally invested in theirs. The forest seemed alive in a way she hadn't noticed before, every whisper of wind and rustle of branches carrying potential stories, lessons, and dangers. Then came a sound that made her sit up straight in bed, a distant but unmistakable growl. Not close enough to panic, but deliberate, strong, and resonant. Her ears strained to locate it. The growl was followed by a series of snapping twigs, closer this time, moving rhythmically toward the cabin. Margaret's pulse accelerated. She recognized the cadence. It wasn't just the adult bear, and it wasn't the cub. Something else, something unseen, was approaching. She grabbed her flashlight, quietly moving to the door. Peering out, her breath fogging the cold glass, she saw only shadows. Then, a shape detached itself from the tree line, a human figure, tall, moving carefully in the dark. Margaret's grip on the door tightened. Was someone else in the forest? A hiker? A poacher? Or had someone been watching her cabin all along? Before she could react, a rustle to her left drew her attention back to the bears. The adult had stopped mid-step, ears pointed toward the noise. The cub froze, uncertain. Margaret realized with a chill that the bear sensed the stranger's presence far before she did. Her mind raced. If the adult bear detected a threat, would it protect its cub aggressively? Could this human figure provoke a dangerous encounter? The minutes stretched, a tense standoff between unseen forces. Margaret felt powerless, caught between the wild intelligence of the bears and the unknown intentions of the stranger in the forest. Her chest tightened, her hands shook. She wanted to retreat, to lock herself safely inside, but something in her resisted. She had never been a person to hide from life's moments, even terrifying ones. Suddenly, the adult bear turned, eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight, and let out a long, low growl. The sound was not meant to threaten her, but to warn. Margaret froze, realizing that the forest, the bears, and she were now entwined in a delicate, tense ballet. The stranger in the shadows stepped back, startled, disappearing as silently as they had appeared. Margaret exhaled slowly, shaking. The bears, after a moment, resumed their path, moving with the same careful, deliberate grace as before. She realized, then, that she was witnessing more than an act of feeding. She was witnessing a story of survival, trust, and instinct played out in real time. And she knew, with a strange mixture of fear and awe, that this story was far from over. As the bears disappeared into the night, Margaret noticed fresh paw prints leading not just to the forest, but circling her cabin, an unspoken promise that they would return, and that whatever came with them might change everything. The following day dawned cold and crisp, with the sun barely cresting over the distant pine-lined horizon. Margaret moved cautiously through her cabin chores, every sound amplified in the quiet wilderness. The events of the previous night replayed endlessly in her mind, the cautious approach of the adult bear, the tentative steps of the cub, and the mysterious figure lurking in the shadows. She could not shake the sense that something larger was at play, that the forest itself had shifted its rhythm around her cabin. Margaret prepared food again, deliberately limiting the portion this time. Berries, small bits of salmon, a scattering of bread crumbs, enough to sustain, not indulge. She placed the bowl on the porch as twilight approached, her movements deliberate and measured. The wind carried a cold tang of pine and snow, and the soft whisper of the trees was broken only by the distant call of a raven. She watched the surrounding forest, eyes scanning for any movement, every nerve alert. As night fell, Margaret's anticipation grew. She had begun to recognize patterns in the bear's behavior, the way the adult led the cub, how it paused and sniffed the air, the protective manner it employed around its young. She was learning, in her own way, to read their signals. And tonight, she felt certain, would provide new insights. The crunch of snow reached her ears first, a familiar rhythm that made her pulse quicken. Emerging from the shadowed tree-line, the adult bear appeared first, moving deliberately toward the porch. The cub followed, hesitant but curious, imitating the careful, measured steps of its guardian. Margaret noticed subtle changes. The cub was beginning to approach the bowl without the adult's nudges, small signs of growing confidence. Her heart swelled with a mixture of pride and awe. But the sense of calm was fleeting. From the corner of her eye, Margaret noticed movement among the trees, something flickering in and out of the shadows. Her pulse quickened. She felt the same instinctive warning she had the night before. The adult bear stiffened, ears swiveling, muscles tensing. The cub froze mid-step, clearly sensing the tension as well. Margaret knew she was witnessing a subtle, unspoken communication between the two animals, a warning, an alert, a preparation for potential danger. Minutes stretched like hours. Then she saw it clearly, a second adult bear, larger, darker, moving slowly along the edge of the clearing. It wasn't aggressive yet, but its presence was deliberate, observant, almost territorial. Margaret's mind raced. This was no longer a simple nightly visit. She had stumbled into a delicate ecosystem of relationships, hierarchy, and instinct. The bears were interacting in ways that transcended basic survival. They were negotiating, silently, in the language of movement and gaze. Margaret felt a surge of awe and apprehension. She realized that every step she had taken, every bowl of food she had placed outside, was now part of a broader narrative she barely understood. The adult bear she had been feeding was not simply coming back for sustenance. It was interacting with the forest and its inhabitants, teaching the cub, and asserting its presence in ways that carried profound meaning. She stayed frozen by the window, absorbing every nuance, the tilt of a head, the flick of an ear, the subtle crouch that signaled readiness. Margaret began to understand that these were not random animals, they were beings with intention, guardianship, and intelligence. And in her own small, human way, she had become a participant in their story. As the two adult bears circled each other, Margaret noticed another detail: their eyes occasionally met hers. Not with aggression, but with recognition. There was an unspoken understanding forming, a fragile bridge between human and animal. She shivered, both from the cold and the intensity of the moment. Feeding them had started as a simple act of kindness. Now it had become a complex interaction, laden with risk and responsibility. Suddenly, the cub made a surprising move. It stepped forward without hesitation and sniffed the edge of the porch, brushing against the adult she had been feeding. The larger bear emitted a low, approving grunt, almost a sound of reassurance. Margaret's chest tightened. She realized she was witnessing a lesson in trust, one that had taken years to perfect in the wild. The cub was learning boundaries, patience, and observation from its guardian, and, in a sense, from her presence as well. Margaret exhaled slowly, her breath forming clouds in the frigid night air. She wanted to step outside, to extend her hand, to reach through the gap of understanding that had formed. But instinct, and perhaps survival, held her back. She understood that her role was subtle: observer, supporter, silent witness. One misstep could shatter the trust that had begun to grow. The interaction stretched on, the tension oscillating between calm and alertness. Margaret's gaze followed the adult bear as it lifted its massive head, sniffing the wind. Something had shifted in the forest. She could feel it, though she could not identify the cause. The cub whimpered softly, a sound that tugged at Margaret's heart. She leaned closer to the window, and then froze. The shadows of the second adult bear had moved closer, circling cautiously, its eyes glinting in the moonlight. Margaret's mind raced. She knew that this could escalate into confrontation, though she hoped it would not. The forest was a place of rules, instincts, and survival. And tonight, she was witnessing those rules in motion. The bears were negotiating, asserting hierarchy, protecting family, all while she remained an outsider, yet intricately woven into their story. A gust of wind carried a scent she did not recognize, something foreign, human, and potentially dangerous. Her pulse spiked. The adult she had been feeding shifted stance, low growl vibrating from deep within its chest. The cub pressed against it, seeking reassurance. Margaret felt a shiver of fear. She was at the edge of understanding, but the forest's rules were not hers to command. Then came the unexpected. The first adult bear moved toward her porch again, nudging the bowl gently, as if to remind her of their connection. The cub followed hesitantly. But the second adult, darker and larger, remained in the shadows, observing, unblinking. Margaret realized with a jolt, the forest had set the stage for a delicate balance. She was no longer simply a witness. She had become part of the narrative, a variable in the complex ecosystem of trust, survival, and family dynamics. Margaret exhaled, her mind racing. She had to consider her next move carefully. This nightly ritual was evolving rapidly, and the stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. She knew the bears would return, that the cub would continue to grow, and that her actions would have consequences she could not yet predict. Just as she began to feel a cautious sense of connection, a sharp crack of a branch echoed from deep within the forest, and the adult bear she had been feeding froze, ears erect, body tense. Something, or someone, was moving closer, and Margaret realized that tonight, her peaceful vigil might be broken in a way she could never have anticipated. Margaret barely slept that night. Her mind was restless, turning over every movement, every glance of the bears from the previous evening. The forest outside her cabin had transformed in her perception from a quiet, predictable backdrop to a living, breathing entity with rules she barely understood. She had come to love her solitude, but now, solitude was laced with tension, unpredictability, and a strange, compelling intimacy with creatures that could crush her in a heartbeat. She woke just before twilight, alert to the slightest sounds of movement outside. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the faintest hints of scent from the forest floor, snow, pine, damp earth, and something else, something she couldn't identify. It was an instinctual awareness, a pulse in the woods that seemed to signal change. Margaret had learned, in her short time observing the bears, that the forest spoke in subtleties, and tonight, it was whispering warnings. Her first task was preparing the food. Berries, bread crumbs, a small piece of smoked salmon. She placed the bowl carefully on the porch, sliding it forward just enough to entice the bears without drawing them dangerously close. The snow beneath her boots crunched softly as she stepped back, heart pounding. She scanned the tree-line. Hours might pass before they appeared, or they might arrive immediately. Either way, she was braced for both awe and danger. The night grew deeper, shadows thickening like a heavy curtain over the landscape. Then she heard it, the familiar crunch of snow. Her pulse quickened. Out of the darkness, the adult bear emerged, followed closely by the cub. Their approach was measured, deliberate, every step cautious. Margaret had memorized their patterns by now, the subtle pauses, the slow sniffing, the way the adult would shift to shield the cub when sensing possible danger. But tonight was different. The larger, darker bear, the intruder from the previous night, was also present, moving at the edge of the clearing. Its presence injected tension into the scene, forcing Margaret to remain perfectly still. The adult bear she had been feeding stopped mid-step, ears rotating toward the shadows, muscles coiled with instinctive readiness. The cub froze, sniffing the cold air. Margaret's chest tightened. She realized that the forest's hierarchy, subtle yet unyielding, was on display before her. The bears began their interaction. The adult nudged the cub forward toward the bowl, yet constantly glanced at the darker bear. There was a quiet negotiation in the air, a delicate dance of boundaries, of trust, of dominance. Margaret understood instinctively that any sudden movement on her part could disrupt the equilibrium. She remained silent, heart hammering, watching the intricate dynamics unfold. Minutes passed like hours. The adult bear finally allowed the cub to eat independently while maintaining a watchful stance. Margaret felt an overwhelming surge of emotion. This was more than survival, it was a lesson in trust, discipline, and guidance. The bears were not merely reacting, they were teaching and learning simultaneously. And she was witnessing it, an invisible observer woven into the fabric of their lives. Then came a sound from the forest, faint but deliberate, a snapping branch, almost in rhythm with her heartbeat. The darker bear stiffened, ears erect, eyes glinting in the moonlight. The adult she had been feeding emitted a low growl, not directed at her, but at the unseen source. The cub whined softly, pressed against the adult's side, sensing the tension. Margaret held her breath. She had seen this before in documentaries, but never this close, never with the stakes so intimately connected to her own presence. Margaret's mind raced. Was it another animal, perhaps a wandering wolf, or an unseen human intruder? The forest had a way of concealing danger until it was too late, and she was beginning to understand the precarious balance of survival here. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted her position behind the window, trying to remain unseen while fully aware of every movement. The bear's response was fascinating. The adult she had fed positioned itself slightly in front of the cub, head low, body tense but controlled. The darker bear circled silently, assessing, waiting, perhaps even testing the boundaries of dominance and territory. Margaret realized she was witnessing something profoundly instinctual, a negotiation of safety, a silent dialogue that spoke of years of experience and survival strategies. She couldn't resist a small, whispered question to herself. What would you do if you were in my shoes, standing so close to these creatures, knowing one wrong move could end everything? Her voice trembled, echoing softly against the wooden walls. The question wasn't rhetorical, it was a genuine confrontation with fear, empathy, and awe. As she watched, the cub made a sudden, bold movement. It stepped toward the darker bear, curiosity overpowering caution. Margaret's breath caught. The adult bear she had been feeding let out a low, rumbling sound, a mixture of warning and reassurance. The interaction was subtle, a delicate negotiation of boundaries, yet it revealed a surprising depth of social complexity. Margaret realized that bears, much like humans, were capable of trust, teaching, and nuanced emotional communication. Then, the unexpected happened. The darker bear, after circling once, turned toward the cub with a deliberate, slow movement. Its eyes seemed almost assessing, contemplative. Margaret's pulse spiked. She had anticipated conflict, but this was not aggression, it was evaluation, an unexpected depth of interaction she had never imagined. She leaned closer to the window, heart racing, understanding fully that she was witnessing not just survival instincts, but a complex social interplay, one that could change dramatically in seconds. The cub, encouraged by the adult she had been feeding, stepped back toward the bowl. The darker bear paused, then retreated slightly into the shadows, watching silently. Margaret exhaled slowly, but her relief was short-lived. Something had shifted, a new tension had entered the air, subtle yet profound. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move. Margaret's mind raced with questions. Were these nightly visits safe to continue? Was she inadvertently influencing the natural behavior of these animals? The emotional bond she felt was powerful, almost overwhelming, yet she knew instinctively that respect, distance, and observation were essential. One misstep could shatter the trust that had begun to form, or provoke an entirely unpredictable reaction. Hours passed, and the bears finally retreated into the darkness, moving with deliberate caution. The cub lingered briefly, looking back at the porch, then disappeared with the adult she had been feeding. Margaret exhaled, exhausted, adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She realized she was no longer merely observing the wilderness, she had become part of a fragile, evolving story, intertwined with instincts, survival, and trust that she barely understood. Just as Margaret began to feel a fragile sense of calm, a new shadow moved through the trees, a large, silent presence she did not recognize. The adult bear froze, ears erect, growl low and warning. Margaret's heart pounded. Something was coming closer, and tonight, the delicate trust she had nurtured might be tested in ways she could never predict. The following night, Margaret felt an unfamiliar mix of anticipation and unease. She had learned the rhythm of the bears, but the forest had proven itself unpredictable. Every snap of a twig, every whisper of wind through the pines, carried a weight she could no longer ignore. She prepared the food carefully, her hands steady but her mind alert. Berries, salmon, and a few bread crumbs were arranged just so, on the porch, a small offering to a relationship she was beginning to understand but could never fully control. The first sounds arrived shortly after twilight. The familiar crunch of snow and rustle of branches marked the approach of the adult bear and cub. Margaret's heart lifted in relief and a faint surge of joy. The cub had grown slightly bolder, stepping forward with more confidence than on previous nights, encouraged by the protective presence of the adult she had been feeding. Margaret could see the intelligence in their movements, the careful pauses, the glances, the subtle nudges that communicated trust and caution simultaneously. But tonight, something was different. The forest held a new tension, a charged anticipation. The darker bear, previously a silent observer, remained at the edge of the clearing, eyes fixed, muscles taut. Margaret noticed that its gaze was not only on the adult she had been feeding but also on her. She shivered. The presence of the forest's uninvited observer made her feel exposed, as though she were under silent scrutiny. Every instinct screamed that she should retreat, yet curiosity and awe rooted her to the window. Then, as if the forest itself were orchestrating a narrative, a distant snapping of twigs broke the fragile calm. Margaret's heart jumped. Something large was moving toward the cabin. She strained to see through the darkness. The adult she had been feeding froze mid-step, ears swiveling, nostrils flaring. The cub whimpered softly, pressing against its guardian. The darker bear stiffened, one paw raised, muscles coiled with tension. Margaret realized she was witnessing an event that could shift the delicate balance entirely. From the shadows emerged not another bear, but a human figure. Tall, cloaked in muted dark clothing, they moved with deliberate caution. Margaret's mind raced. Could it be a hunter? A hiker lost in the snow? Or worse, someone with intentions that could provoke danger for both her and the bears? She stepped back slightly, wishing for invisibility, wishing the forest would swallow her presence, but there was no turning away. The bears had noticed the intruder as well. Their reactions were subtle yet unmistakable, posture tightening, low growls rumbling from deep within their chests. Margaret held her breath. The adult bear nudged the cub forward, closer to the safety of the porch, but never breaking the line of sight with the stranger. The darker bear circled closer, a silent sentinel assessing threats. She could feel the tension radiating from every being in the clearing. The forest was alive with unspoken dialogue, and she was both participant and witness, caught in a web of instinct, observation, and survival. Minutes dragged on, heavy and taut. The stranger stopped at the edge of the clearing, apparently sensing the invisible boundary enforced by the bears. Margaret's heart pounded so violently she feared it might betray her presence. She reminded herself, no sudden movements, no loud noises, nothing that could disrupt the fragile narrative unfolding before her. Then, unexpectedly, the adult bear she had been feeding approached her cautiously, sniffing the air, glancing repeatedly at the intruder. Margaret's pulse surged with a mixture of fear and awe. There was no aggression, yet every muscle was poised, ready to protect. She realized with a shock that the bear's trust in her was growing, that it viewed her presence not as a threat but as part of the environment it could navigate safely. And yet, the stranger's presence had introduced a new variable, one the bear could not ignore. Margaret's mind raced. Should she step outside to guide the intruder away? No, she reminded herself, her role was observation, not intervention. One wrong move could trigger aggression or frighten the animals. She stayed perfectly still, heart hammering, watching the delicate balance of instinct, caution, and subtle communication unfold. The cub, emboldened by the adult's calm, stepped closer to the bowl. Its movements were tentative, careful, yet deliberate. Margaret's chest tightened. She realized she was watching a lesson in trust and learning in real time, a mother or father guiding the young, teaching survival, and establishing boundaries, all under the subtle scrutiny of the forest's sentinel, the darker bear. Then came a sound that made her freeze, a low, drawn-out growl from the darker bear, warning in tone but restrained, controlled. Margaret's stomach churned. The stranger froze, clearly aware that they had crossed an invisible line. The adult she had been feeding let out a softer rumble, positioning itself closer to the cub, nudging it toward the safety of the porch while maintaining a watchful gaze on the intruder. Margaret's chest tightened further. She was witnessing a dialogue without words, the forest's rules enacted through movement, posture, and intent. Suddenly, the stranger made a step forward, breaking the invisible tension with human recklessness. The darker bear lunged slightly, claws scraping lightly against snow, teeth bared, not in attack, but as an unmistakable warning. Margaret gasped softly. The adult bear she had been feeding raised itself slightly, growl deepening, as though saying, "This is my domain, this is my family, and I will not allow disruption." Margaret's mind raced with fear and empathy. The bears were communicating, negotiating, asserting dominance, teaching, and protecting all at once. She had never realized the profound depth of animal intelligence, how it could mirror human emotion and logic, yet operate in a world entirely bound by instinct. And she knew that her simple act of feeding them had placed her in the midst of this complex ecosystem. Time seemed to stretch infinitely. The stranger hesitated, sensing the boundaries reinforced by both bears. The cub, initially tense, relaxed slightly, recognizing the adult's calm guidance. Margaret exhaled slowly. She had survived, observing without interference. Yet the night had revealed the razor's edge upon which trust and danger balanced in the wilderness. Finally, the intruder retreated, leaving the clearing silent once more. The adult bear she had been feeding nudged the cub gently, and together they approached the bowl again, resuming their ritual with a newfound caution and awareness. Margaret's breath caught. She realized that the bear's nightly visits were no longer merely about food, they were now about vigilance, awareness, and the complex network of interactions that governed life in the wild. Margaret's hands shook slightly as she closed the window. The adrenaline lingered, but beneath it, an overwhelming sense of connection and responsibility had taken root. She understood now that every action she took mattered, each bowl of food, each step on the porch, each breath in the night air influenced the delicate balance of trust she had nurtured with these wild creatures. Just as Margaret turned to retreat into the safety of her cabin, a shadow moved near the tree-line, a third bear, larger and more imposing than any she had seen before, observing silently. Its eyes locked onto the porch, and Margaret realized with a jolt that her quiet vigil was about to face its most profound test yet. Margaret's breath caught as she saw the shadow of the third bear lingering near the tree-line. It was massive, its fur darker than the others, eyes glinting in the pale moonlight like two shards of amber. Her heart raced, not only from fear, but from the surreal realization that she was witnessing a new layer of complexity in the forest's hierarchy. This bear was not moving carelessly, it was deliberate, observing, calculating. Margaret's pulse quickened. The adult she had been feeding stiffened immediately, nudging the cub closer, the protective instinct almost tangible. The cub, sensing tension in both bears, whimpered softly and pressed against its guardian. Margaret felt a pang of empathy for the small creature. She had begun to see it not just as an animal, but as a being learning lessons of trust, caution, and survival in the harsh wilderness. The dark intruder's presence disrupted the fragile rhythm of the evening. She knew instinctively that the balance the bears had maintained over previous nights could collapse in seconds. Margaret remained still, silent, trying not to draw attention. Her breath fogged the window as she leaned closer, eyes wide. She noticed the subtle movements of the adult bear she had fed. It positioned itself slightly in front of the cub, muscles tensed, ears swiveling constantly. There was no aggression yet, but the posture was a warning, a declaration of guardianship. The darker, larger bear's presence had introduced an unseen pressure, invisible threads of tension weaving through the clearing. For minutes, nothing happened. The new bear simply watched. Margaret's mind raced with questions. Was this third bear a rival? A guardian of the forest claiming territory? Or perhaps a solitary, wandering adult, assessing the situation with instinctive calculation? She could not know, but she understood that its appearance had shifted the dynamics entirely. The adult bear she had been feeding was no longer relaxed, every step, every glance, was measured. The cub mirrored its guardian's caution, hesitant yet learning from the adult's silent instruction. Margaret noticed a small behavioral cue she hadn't seen before. The adult she had been feeding tilted its head slightly toward her window, nostrils flaring. It wasn't aggression, nor was it simple curiosity. It was recognition, a subtle acknowledgement of her presence, almost as if it understood that she was a participant in this delicate scenario, not a mere observer. Margaret shivered. The emotional connection she felt was profound, but also terrifying. She was part of a story she could not control, yet her presence mattered. The third bear, meanwhile, remained still, a silent sentinel in the shadows. Margaret could see the faint puff of its breath in the cold night air, the subtle shifting of weight as it balanced on powerful limbs. There was intelligence in its gaze, an assessment of every variable, the first bear, the cub, Margaret herself, and the surrounding forest. She realized that she had underestimated the complexity of their interactions. These creatures were not merely following instincts, they were navigating relationships, hierarchies, and social boundaries in real time. Then, the adult bear she had been feeding made a surprising move. It stepped closer to Margaret's porch, nudging the cub forward to encourage a bite of the food, yet keeping an eye on the dark intruder. Margaret's heart pounded. The bear's actions were deliberate, almost diplomatic, asserting guardianship while acknowledging the intruder's presence. It was teaching the cub lessons in strategy, patience, and awareness, all within the span of moments that felt infinitely stretched in the cold, quiet forest. Margaret realized that the cub's behavior had changed subtly too. It was more confident, stepping cautiously but deliberately toward the food, learning from both the adult's guidance and the intruder's silent presence. She felt a mixture of awe and fear. She was observing a social lesson in survival, hierarchy, and instinct, unfolding like a complex, living drama. Suddenly, a sharp snap of a branch broke the fragile calm. Margaret's breath caught. The third bear shifted, its body coiled like a spring, muscles rippling under thick fur. The adult she had been feeding emitted a low, deep rumble, a warning, protective, controlled, but unmistakable. The cub whined softly, pressing against the adult's side. Margaret could feel the tension radiating from every being in the clearing, a palpable energy that made her chest tighten. The new bear stepped closer, not aggressively, but with deliberate purpose. Margaret held her breath. She understood that one wrong move, hers or the bear's, could ignite chaos. Her mind raced. Should she intervene? Could she intervene? The answer, she knew, was no. Her role was observation, respect, and careful silence. She had become a part of this ecosystem, a variable whose influence mattered, yet whose power was limited. The adult she had been feeding shifted slightly, nudging the cub towards safety, then taking a deliberate stance facing the third bear. There was no growl, no attack, only a silent communication of boundary and authority. Margaret's pulse thudded violently. She had never imagined that the lessons of survival, trust, and protection could be so vividly displayed in real time, so close to her cabin. Minutes passed like hours. The third bear eventually paused, evaluating the first bear and the cub, then retreated slightly into the shadows. Margaret exhaled slowly, her hands trembling around the window frame. The cub cautiously resumed nibbling from the bowl, encouraged by the adult's calm yet watchful stance. Margaret realized that the bear's nightly ritual was evolving into something far more complex than she had ever anticipated. It was no longer merely about food, it was about hierarchy, protection, trust, and observation. As she watched, Margaret felt an overwhelming surge of emotion. She understood the profound responsibility she carried, the delicate balance she had unwittingly influenced by leaving simple offerings of food. These animals had adapted to her presence, and yet, the forest always held new variables, new challenges. Tonight had reminded her that wild creatures, no matter how familiar, demanded respect, vigilance, and humility. Just as Margaret began to relax, thinking the night's danger had passed, a sudden, sharp rustle erupted from behind the cabin, closer than ever before. The adult bear froze, the cub whimpered, and the third bear's eyes glowed in the dark. Something, or someone, was moving toward them, and Margaret realized with a jolt that the coming encounter could change everything she thought she understood about trust, survival, and the forest itself. Margaret's chest tightened as the rustle behind the cabin grew louder. Her pulse raced, every instinct screaming for caution. She pressed closer to the frosted window, fingers gripping the frame, eyes straining in the pale moonlight. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The adult bear she had been feeding froze mid-step, muscles taut, ears swiveling to pinpoint the source of the disturbance. The cub huddled against its guardian, small body trembling but curious, mirroring every subtle cue from the adult. Margaret realized instantly that this was no ordinary night. Something, or someone, was encroaching on the delicate balance of trust and safety she had helped nurture. The third bear, massive and dark, remained at the edge of the clearing, eyes fixed, unblinking, almost as if it too had noticed the intrusion. The atmosphere thickened with tension, every sound amplified, the soft crunch of snow, the creak of branches, the faint whistle of wind through the pine needles. Then she saw movement, a figure emerging from the shadows behind the cabin. Margaret's heart leapt into her throat. It was not a bear. It was a human, a hunter, or perhaps a lost hiker. The silhouette moved deliberately, but with a lack of awareness of the bear's presence. Margaret's mind raced. She knew instinctively that any sudden motion could provoke chaos. She remained frozen, silent, barely daring to breathe. The adult bear she had been feeding shifted slightly, positioning itself between the cub and the unseen intruder. Its stance was deliberate, protective, yet restrained. Margaret felt a surge of awe. The animal was teaching the cub boundaries, asserting guardianship, and maintaining a cautious diplomacy with the unknown presence, all without a single sound. She realized that she was witnessing a living demonstration of instincts, trust, and intelligence that transcended human understanding. The cub whimpered softly, taking tentative steps toward the safety of the porch. Margaret's chest tightened. She had grown to see the cub almost as her own companion in the night, vulnerable yet learning, innocent yet keenly aware of danger. The relationship between the adult and the cub had become an emotional mirror to the bond forming between Margaret and the animals, a silent, fragile trust built on observation, respect, and patience. Suddenly, the figure behind the cabin froze. Margaret noticed the way its body tensed, almost imperceptibly, as if sensing the presence of the first bear and the cub. The third bear, massive and imposing, began to shift, emerging slightly from the shadows, its gaze fixed on both the intruder and the clearing. Margaret felt her pulse spike. The forest was a stage for a complex negotiation she could neither control nor fully understand, yet she was inextricably part of it. The adult bear nudged the cub forward, encouraging it to continue toward the food bowl, while keeping one eye on the intruder. Every movement was measured, deliberate, and purposeful. Margaret's mind raced. She understood now that her nightly offerings had become more than sustenance. They were part of a social ritual, a lesson in trust, protection, and awareness. She could feel the emotional intelligence radiating from the adult bear, a depth she had never imagined possible in the wild. Minutes stretched, each second heavy with suspense. The intruder moved slowly, cautiously, unaware of the potential consequences of crossing invisible boundaries. Margaret's hands trembled slightly, pressing against the cold window. She felt a surge of empathy for all involved, the bears, the cub, and even the human figure unknowingly stepping into a high-stakes interaction. She realized that she had become part of a living narrative, a participant in a story larger than herself, unfolding in the quiet wilderness. Then, without warning, the intruder stepped closer to the porch. The third bear let out a low, rumbling growl, a controlled warning that resonated through the clearing. The adult she had been feeding mirrored the stance, chest lowered, muscles taut, eyes never leaving the intruder. The cub froze mid-step, tail bristling slightly. Margaret held her breath, aware that the slightest noise or motion could ignite a confrontation. The intruder stopped, hands raised slightly in a gesture of innocence, though the bears could not interpret human intention. Margaret felt her pulse hammering in her ears. The forest seemed to contract, holding its tension in every shadow, every branch, every breath of wind. The relationship she had nurtured with the adult bear and cub was now being tested against an unpredictable variable she could not control. Margaret realized that the night's events were more than an intrusion, they were a trial. The adult bear's protective instincts, the cub's cautious learning, and the third bear's silent observation had converged into a delicate equilibrium, one that could collapse in an instant. She had come to understand the profound intelligence and emotional depth of these animals, and now she faced the terrifying possibility that her bond with them could be threatened, not by malice, but by the unpredictable nature of the forest and its other inhabitants. Then came a shift. The intruder took one more step forward, and the cub, emboldened by the adult's calm and steady presence, sniffed the air curiously. Margaret's chest tightened. She understood that the cub was learning critical lessons in bravery, trust, and awareness, guided by instinct and careful observation. The adult bear nudged it gently, teaching the value of caution and strategy, while simultaneously signaling to the intruder that boundaries existed and must be respected. Margaret's mind raced with possibilities. Should she intervene? Could she safely guide the intruder away without disrupting the fragile trust she had cultivated? She realized with a mix of awe and fear that her role was complex: observer, protector in spirit, participant in a story she could influence but never fully control. Every heartbeat, every decision, had the potential to change the outcome. Suddenly, the intruder froze completely. Margaret followed its gaze and noticed a new, subtle movement, another shadow flitting through the trees, perhaps a third bear, or some other forest inhabitant. The adult she had been feeding stiffened, growled low and controlled, nudging the cub further toward the porch. The third bear shifted, muscles coiled, eyes fixed, as though calculating the risk and preparing for a defensive action. Margaret's chest tightened as adrenaline surged through her veins. Just as Margaret felt she might finally exhale, a loud, sharp crack echoed from the tree-line behind the intruder. The adult bear froze, the cub whimpered, and the third bear stepped forward from the shadows, its full size revealed in the moonlight. Margaret realized with a jolt that the night's events were about to escalate into a confrontation she could neither predict nor control. Margaret's heart pounded as the forest seemed to contract around her cabin, shadows lengthening unnaturally in the moonlight. The adult bear she had been feeding and the cub were frozen near the food bowl, muscles coiled, ears swiveling, eyes locked on the encroaching presence behind the cabin. The third bear stepped fully into view, its immense size dwarfing the first adult, fur bristling slightly, eyes glowing in the faint light. Margaret could feel the tension vibrating through the air, as though the very forest itself had become a living trap. The intruder, human, she realized, stood rooted in place, unaware of the danger their proximity posed. Margaret's pulse raced. She knew that any sudden move, even an accidental one, could provoke a reaction that would escalate in seconds. She pressed herself against the frosted window, trying to remain unseen while her mind raced for solutions. But she also knew this was no longer a simple observation. The survival of the cub, the trust of the adult bear, and perhaps even her own safety depended on the delicate interplay unfolding outside. The adult bear she had been feeding made a subtle, deliberate movement. It shifted slightly forward, nudging the cub toward the relative safety of the porch while keeping a fixed gaze on the third bear. Margaret's chest tightened. The adult was not threatening, but asserting a boundary, communicating in a language Margaret could feel but not fully interpret. Every muscle was taut, every paw poised for immediate action. Margaret marveled at the bear's instinctive clarity, the ability to balance protection and caution simultaneously, teaching the cub while negotiating with the larger presence. The third bear, meanwhile, paused, sniffing the cold air. Margaret noticed a faint tension in its shoulders, a readiness coiled like a spring. Its gaze shifted subtly from the adult bear to the cub, and then to the human intruder. It was clear this bear was assessing not only threats, but alliances, strategies, and potential outcomes. Margaret's admiration for their intelligence was tempered by fear. She understood fully that these creatures were not predictable in the way domestic animals or humans might be. The forest had rules, and they were enforced silently, lethally, and without compromise. The intruder finally moved, just a small step forward, but it was enough to provoke a ripple of tension. The adult bear let out a low, controlled rumble, warning without aggression. The cub whined softly, pressing against its guardian. Margaret felt her own chest tighten. She knew instinctively that the bear's communication was multi-layered, protective, strategic, and instructive for the cub. She had never witnessed such nuanced behavior so closely. Margaret wondered if she should intervene, but quickly realized any action could shatter the fragile trust she had nurtured. She remained perfectly still, heart hammering, watching the silent negotiation unfold. The adult bear took a careful step toward the porch, positioning itself between the cub and the third bear. Margaret's hands trembled. She felt the weight of the responsibility pressing down on her, not just as an observer, but as a silent participant whose presence had become part of the ecosystem's equilibrium. Then, something unexpected happened. The third bear let out a low, drawn-out growl, a subtle warning, and the first adult bear responded with a rumble of its own. The cub froze, tail bristling slightly, caught in the middle of this silent standoff. Margaret's pulse raced. She realized she was witnessing a complex negotiation, dominance, territory, and protection communicated entirely through posture, sound, and subtle body language. She had never felt so intensely the intelligence and emotional depth of wild creatures. Time stretched as minutes passed in agonizing slowness. The third bear circled slightly, sniffing the air, watching both the first adult and the cub. The intruder remained motionless, apparently sensing the danger without fully comprehending it. Margaret's heart hammered. She knew one misstep could provoke a chase, a confrontation, or worse. The entire clearing was charged with energy, the tension almost tangible in the crisp night air. The adult bear nudged the cub toward the porch again, a gentle yet insistent movement. Margaret felt a surge of emotion. This was more than survival, it was a lesson in trust, courage, and communication. The cub hesitated, then took another tentative step, encouraged by the adult's calm presence and subtle guidance. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She had become part of something profound, a silent witness to life, intelligence, and instinct at its most raw and intricate. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed from deeper in the forest. All three bears stiffened, ears swiveling, bodies coiled like springs. Margaret gasped. The intruder's eyes widened, and the third bear's growl deepened, resonant and controlled. The adult bear she had been feeding positioned itself fully between the cub and the third bear, muscles taut, chest lowered. Margaret could feel the intensity radiating through every being in the clearing. Then, the third bear lunged, not at the cub, not aggressively, but in a swift, calculated move to assert dominance over the clearing. The adult bear met it head-on, chest to chest, growls resonating, paws digging into the snow. Margaret's hands clutched the window frame. She could see every detail, the way the cub watched, learning the rules of survival, trust, and strategy from its guardian. She had never felt more intimately connected to the wilderness, yet never more at risk. The two bears circled each other, slow and deliberate, a dance of strength, intelligence, and instinct. Margaret felt a surge of awe and fear. She understood the stakes, hierarchy was being tested, boundaries enforced, lessons taught, and her presence was an unpredictable variable. The cub whimpered softly, mimicking the adult's caution but learning to navigate the situation. Margaret's chest tightened. She realized fully how delicate this balance was, how quickly trust could be lost, and how profoundly she had become part of this ecosystem. Then, without warning, the intruder took a step backward, retreating slowly. The third bear's growl softened slightly, though it remained vigilant. The adult bear nudged the cub, signaling the end of the standoff. Margaret exhaled slowly, adrenaline coursing through her veins. The immediate threat had passed, but the emotional and instinctual intensity lingered, a reminder of the raw power of life in the wilderness. Just as Margaret thought the night had settled, the third bear's eyes fixed on the cabin itself. It was no longer merely a sentinel, it was moving closer to the porch, silent, deliberate, and with an intelligence that suggested it had noticed her presence. Margaret realized with a jolt that her bond with the first bear and cub was about to be tested in ways she had never imagined. Margaret's heart hammered as the third bear stepped closer to the porch. Its massive frame moved with deliberate caution, muscles rippling under dark fur, eyes glinting in the pale moonlight. She pressed herself against the frosted window, frozen yet hyper-aware, every instinct screaming at her to stay perfectly still. The adult bear she had been feeding shifted slightly, nudging the cub toward the porch, a protective gesture that radiated authority and care. Margaret realized with awe that she was witnessing not only survival instincts but profound intelligence and emotional depth in the wild. The cub whimpered softly, uncertainty coloring its actions, yet it was learning from the adult bear's cues, how to navigate risk, how to gauge threats, and how to trust guidance. Margaret felt her chest tighten. Over the past nights, she had seen these creatures adapt, evolve, and communicate in ways that transcended instinct alone. And now, faced with the third bear, all those lessons were being tested under heightened tension. The intruder, human and unaware of the bear's complex social choreography, froze at the edge of the clearing. Margaret realized that their presence had become an unpredictable variable, one that could trigger chaos with the slightest misstep. She exhaled slowly, reminding herself that observation and restraint were her only tools. The night demanded patience, vigilance, and humility. Then, something unexpected occurred. The third bear paused, its head tilting slightly, eyes fixed not on Margaret, not on the cub, but on the adult bear she had been feeding. Its posture softened, tension in its shoulders easing fractionally. Margaret's pulse quickened. Could it be that the third bear was not a threat, but assessing the situation, evaluating hierarchy, and perhaps even considering alliance? She held her breath. Every instinct told her that this was a rare moment of potential understanding, a delicate pause in a high-stakes dance. The adult bear responded subtly. It lowered its chest, nudged the cub closer, and maintained a watchful gaze on the third bear. The cub mirrored the movement, instinctively learning from its guardian that caution and patience were key to navigating uncertainty. Margaret's awe deepened. She realized that the forest had taught these creatures lessons she could never have anticipated, lessons about communication, boundaries, and the delicate negotiation of trust. Minutes passed in tense silence. Margaret could see the third bear slowly circling, sniffing the air, evaluating the adult and the cub. There was no aggression, only calculated observation. Margaret's heart raced. She understood that the night's events were not merely about confrontation, they were about establishing understanding, boundaries, and respect. The cub, previously hesitant, began to mimic the adult's measured movements, demonstrating that learning and adaptation were taking place in real time. Suddenly, a low growl emanated from the third bear, controlled and deliberate. Margaret's chest tightened. She could see the subtle shift in the adult bear's stance, muscles coiled, yet relaxed enough to suggest acknowledgement rather than aggression. The cub froze, sensing the tension but also the potential for a resolution. Margaret felt a shiver of awe and fear. The intelligence displayed by these creatures was staggering. They were not simply reacting, they were negotiating, communicating, and teaching simultaneously. Then came the twist. The third bear stepped even closer, lowering its head slightly, and emitted a soft, almost inquisitive grunt. Margaret's breath caught. The adult bear responded with a gentle rumble, nudging the cub closer to safety. It was a moment of silent understanding, an unspoken acknowledgement that the third bear was not here to dominate, but to observe, perhaps even to protect. Margaret's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and wonder. The night had transformed from confrontation to a delicate alliance, a revelation that the forest operated on complex social codes she could barely comprehend. The cub, emboldened by the adult's calm and the third bear's non-threatening posture, tentatively approached the food bowl. Margaret's chest tightened as she realized the profound significance of this simple act. The cub was learning to navigate trust, courage, and social hierarchy under the guidance of instinct and careful observation. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. She had become part of something extraordinary, a living, evolving drama of survival, intelligence, and emotional connection. But the night was far from over. A sudden sound from deeper in the forest, another snap of a branch, closer than before, shifted the energy instantly. All three bears froze. Margaret's heart raced. The intruder remained motionless, but now fully aware that the forest's dynamics had shifted. The third bear's posture stiffened slightly, muscles coiled like springs, eyes fixed on the unseen source of the sound. Margaret felt her pulse spike. The adult bear nudged the cub once more, a protective gesture that radiated both authority and reassurance. The cub pressed against its guardian, instinctively sensing the rules of engagement and the boundaries that had been silently communicated over the past nights. Margaret marveled at the depth of their intelligence, the way lessons were being passed down through body language, subtle cues, and instinctual guidance. Then, the unexpected happened. The third bear moved even closer, positioning itself slightly behind the first adult bear and the cub. Its eyes softened, and it emitted a low, rumbling sound, a tone Margaret interpreted as approval or at least acknowledgement. The adult bear relaxed fractionally, nudging the cub toward the porch again. Margaret's chest tightened. She understood that a fragile alliance had been formed. The third bear was no longer a threat, but a silent ally, a guardian who respected the boundaries and the established trust. Margaret realized the full emotional impact of the night. She had witnessed not just survival, but an intricate social negotiation, the development of trust, and the unspoken rules that govern the lives of these intelligent creatures. Her presence, once a variable of unknown consequence, had become a part of this ecosystem's narrative, a silent participant in a drama of instinct, intelligence, and empathy. The forest settled into a cautious calm. The intruder, seemingly understanding the danger, began to retreat slowly, carefully, without sudden movements. Margaret exhaled slowly, her heart still racing. The adult bear she had been feeding returned to its protective stance near the cub, and the third bear receded into the shadows, maintaining a watchful eye on both humans and bears alike. Just as Margaret allowed herself a moment of relief, she noticed movement near the tree-line, smaller shapes, numerous and deliberate, approaching silently. The cub froze, the adult bear stiffened, and the third bear's eyes glowed faintly. Margaret's heart sank as she realized that the night was far from over, and that the forest had yet another challenge in store, one that could test the bonds she had built and the trust she had nurtured to their very limits. Margaret's heart raced as the shapes in the tree-line slowly emerged. She squinted through the frosted window, her breath fogging the glass. The snow-dusted forest was alive with movement, smaller bears, likely juveniles, and possibly other adult observers, all emerging cautiously. The adult bear she had been feeding stiffened, pressing the cub slightly behind it, but there was no panic, only measured alertness. Margaret felt a wave of awe mixed with fear. The forest was revealing a broader social structure, and she was witnessing a phenomenon few humans would ever see. The third bear remained a sentinel, positioned behind the first adult and cub, its posture protective but calm. Margaret realized with a jolt that this bear had assumed a role of silent guardian, ensuring that any further intrusion would be evaluated before action. She felt an overwhelming surge of gratitude toward the intelligent animal. Her nightly acts of care, simple bowls of food, had become a bridge of trust, not just between herself and the first bear, but within the wider circle of the forest community. The adult bear she had been feeding shifted slightly, encouraging the cub to stay close and maintain composure. Margaret's chest tightened as she realized the cub was learning more than survival, it was learning the subtle rules of trust, courage, and hierarchy, guided entirely by instinct and observation. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. These lessons were being handed down silently, yet with precision and emotional depth that was almost impossible to describe. Suddenly, one of the smaller bears, a juvenile, ventured closer to the porch, sniffing the air. The first adult bear's gaze softened slightly, its stance relaxed just enough to allow the newcomer's cautious exploration. Margaret could sense the unspoken communication, guidelines for behavior, boundaries, and respect being conveyed without sound. She was witnessing a living social contract, forged through instinct, experience, and observation. The cub, emboldened by the adult's calm presence, took a few steps toward the food bowl, mirroring the behavior of the newcomers. Margaret's chest swelled with emotion. She had nurtured a fragile bond, and now it was influencing not just one bear, but a small network of forest inhabitants. The third bear remained vigilant, yet its eyes softened, a silent acknowledgement of the trust being extended across the group. Margaret realized the intruder had retreated further into the forest. She exhaled slowly, relief washing over her. The immediate danger had passed, but the emotional intensity lingered. She had been part of a narrative that transcended ordinary human experience, a story of intelligence, trust, protection, and the fragile beauty of life in the wilderness. Her nightly routines of observation and food placement had grown into something much larger, a participation in a living ecosystem, a witness to the subtle laws that govern the social and emotional lives of these creatures. The adult bear nudged the cub gently toward the edge of the porch, signaling that it was safe to explore within the boundaries of their established trust. Margaret marveled at the precision of the communication, the way the cub responded instinctively, absorbing lessons through observation alone. The third bear, observing from a few feet back, emitted a low, almost approving rumble. Margaret realized that the forest had orchestrated a delicate balance, teaching her lessons about patience, humility, and the extraordinary intelligence of wild animals. Minutes passed as the bears slowly explored the clearing. The cub ventured toward the snow-dusted food bowl, tasting morsels with caution and curiosity. The adult bear watched attentively, guiding each movement with subtle nudges and posture adjustments. The third bear lingered, eyes scanning the surroundings, ensuring that no further disturbances occurred. Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes. She had come to the forest expecting solitude, perhaps a glimpse of wildlife, but instead, she had become part of an intricate, living drama of trust, learning, and connection. Then came the moment of emotional resolution. The cub, now more confident, approached Margaret's window, sniffing near the sill as if acknowledging her presence. Margaret whispered softly, her voice trembling with emotion. The adult bear followed, glancing briefly at her before returning to its protective stance. The third bear, a silent observer throughout the night, stepped slightly forward, its eyes reflecting moonlight and intelligence. Margaret understood this as a profound gesture of acceptance. Trust had been extended, bonds had been formed, and the forest had validated her presence. The forest settled into a quiet rhythm. The intruder had vanished, the smaller bears receded into the treeline, and the night's tension dissipated into the crisp winter air. Margaret watched the cub curl near the adult, warmth and safety radiating from the connection. The third bear retreated slightly, maintaining vigilance but allowing space for the established pair. Margaret's heart ached with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and reverence. She had learned lessons that could not be taught in classrooms or books, lessons about empathy, observation, patience, and the silent, complex intelligence of wild animals. Margaret stepped back from the window, exhaling deeply. She felt a sense of closure, yet the story was far from over. The bonds she had nurtured would continue to evolve, each night offering new lessons and challenges. She understood that her presence mattered, yet she also understood her limitations. The forest was not hers to control, it was a living, breathing entity governed by laws she could only observe, respect, and adapt to. As she prepared for the first light of dawn, Margaret reflected on the night's events. The bears had demonstrated courage, patience, and intelligence. The cub had learned critical lessons about trust and survival. The third bear had shown that even formidable strangers could become allies through observation and mutual respect. And she, Margaret, had learned about the delicate interplay between humans and wildlife, about empathy, humility, and the extraordinary responsibility that comes with connection. She placed her hands gently on the frosted window, whispering softly, "Thank you." The adult bear glanced briefly at her, a subtle tilt of the head that felt almost like acknowledgement. The cub pressed closer to its guardian, warmth radiating in the cold night. The third bear lingered a moment longer, then disappeared silently into the forest. Margaret exhaled fully, a mixture of exhaustion, awe, and profound gratitude washing over her. The sun began to rise, pale light filtering through snow-laden pines. The forest glowed softly in shades of silver and gold, the night's tension dissolving into calm. Margaret realized that she had been part of something extraordinary, a story of survival, trust, and the quiet, powerful intelligence of wild creatures. Her nightly offerings had created more than nourishment, they had fostered understanding, connection, and a fragile, beautiful bond between human and animal. Margaret stepped outside onto the porch, the crisp morning air biting her cheeks. The cub approached cautiously, sniffing her hand before returning to the adult bear. The forest was alive with sound, the wind through pine needles, distant calls of wildlife, the soft crunch of snow beneath paws. She realized that every night offered new lessons, new challenges, and new opportunities for connection. "What would you have done if you were here?" she whispered to the silent wilderness. The story was far from over, but tonight had forged bonds that would endure, silent, intelligent, and deeply emotional.